Isabella Izzy Rodriguez stood motionless in the corner of Pemberton Gallery's main auction floor, her thick-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh spotlights as Vincent Pemberton screamed inches from her face about a supposedly damaged Monet restoration.
What? Since Cruz Aguadas supposedly damaged Monet restoration.
To every observer in the room, she appeared to be a terrified 26-year-old art restoration assistant, trembling under the verbal assault from one of New York's most powerful art dealers. What they couldn't see was the calculated precision behind her wide eyes as she memorized every detail of Pemberton's reaction, cataloged the defensive responses of his associates, and mentally updated the timeline for bringing down the most sophisticated art forgery and money laundering operation the FBI had ever discovered. In 18 months of deep undercover work, this moment of public humiliation would provide the final piece of evidence needed to destroy an empire built on stolen masterpieces and blood money. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scene unfolding in Pemberton Galleries was carefully orchestrated theater, though only Izzy knew she was the playwright, director, and lead actress in a performance that would soon bring down some of the most influential figures in the international art world. Vincent Pemberton's rage over the allegedly botched restoration of a Monet water lily painting was genuine, but the damage itself had been meticulously planned by Izzy as the perfect catalyst for exposing the network of forgers, dealers, and wealthy collectors who had been trafficking stolen art for over a decade. Izzy had spent the previous 18 months transforming herself from FBI Special Agent Isabella Rodriguez, a specialist in financial crimes with degrees in art history and forensic accounting, into Izzy, a socially awkward graduate student who had somehow landed an entry-level position at one of Manhattan's most exclusive galleries. The transformation had required not just changes in appearance and demeanor, but the development of an entirely fictional background, complete with academic records, employment history, and personal relationships that could withstand scrutiny from paranoid criminals. The undercover operation had begun when the FBI's art crime team identified Pemberton Galleries as the likely center of a sophisticated network that was laundering money through the sale of forged and stolen artwork. Traditional investigative methods had failed to penetrate the insular world of high-end art dealing, where relationships were built over decades, and trust was extended only to those with impeccable credentials and social connections that Izzy, as a federal agent, could never authentically possess. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The challenge of infiltrating Pemberton's organization had required months of preparation before Izzy could even apply for a position at the gallery. She had needed to establish a credible academic background in art restoration, develop technical skills that would make her valuable to the operation, and create a personal history that would explain her need for employment and her willingness to overlook suspicious activities in exchange for career advancement. Vincent Pemberton himself was a study in contradictions that had made him both successful and ultimately vulnerable to the investigation that would destroy him. Publicly, he was known as a sophisticated connoisseur, who had built his gallery's reputation on discovering overlooked masterpieces and connecting discerning collectors with extraordinary works of art. Privately, he operated a network that included forgers capable of creating convincing replicas of famous paintings, corrupt auction house employees who could authenticate fake provenance documents, and wealthy clients who were willing to pay premium prices for stolen artwork, as long as their ownership could never be traced back to the original crimes. The sophistication of Pemberton's operation had initially made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to gather evidence of criminal activity. Transactions were conducted through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts that obscured the true ownership of both the artwork and the money being laundered. Communications were conducted in coded language that could be interpreted as legitimate business discussions about artistic technique and market values. Most importantly, everyone involved in the network had too much to lose to cooperate with law enforcement, creating a wall of silence that traditional investigative methods could not penetrate. Izzy's insertion into the organization had required a carefully constructed legend that would make her both valuable and non-threatening to Pemberton's existing network. Her cover identity as a graduate student in art restoration with student loan debt and limited family connections made her appear desperate enough to ignore suspicious activities while possessing skills that could be useful to the organization. Her apparent social awkwardness and tendency to focus obsessively on technical details made her seem unlikely to understand the broader implications of the work she was being asked to perform. The 18 months that Izzy had spent building her cover and gaining access to progressively more sensitive aspects of Pemberton's operation had been a masterclass in patience and psychological manipulation. She had needed to demonstrate technical competence without appearing too knowledgeable, show financial desperation without seeming like someone who might steal from the gallery, and display personal vulnerability without creating the impression that she might crack under pressure and expose the operation to law enforcement. Each day of the undercover assignment had required Izzy to balance multiple competing demands, gathering evidence of criminal activity while performing her cover job competently enough to maintain access, building relationships with other members of the network while avoiding suspicion about her true loyalties, and documenting crimes while ensuring that her investigative activities would not be discovered by increasingly paranoid criminals who had built their organization specifically to avoid law enforcement detection. The verbal assault that Izzy was now enduring from Vincent Pemberton represented the culmination of months of careful planning designed to create the exact scenario that would provide her with access to the evidence needed to bring down the entire network. The supposedly damaged Monet was actually a forgery that Izzy had deliberately altered during the restoration process, knowing that Pemberton's reaction would reveal crucial information about the painting's true origin and the network's methods for creating convincing fake documentation. As Pemberton continued his tirade, describing in detail how Izzy's incompetence had potentially cost the gallery millions of dollars and threatened relationships with their most important clients, she was mentally recording every word while analyzing the reactions of other staff members whose responses would help her understand their roles in the criminal organization. Her apparent paralysis under his verbal assault was actually focused observation designed to gather the final pieces of evidence needed to support federal prosecutors in bringing charges that would result in lengthy prison sentences for everyone involved. The moment when Pemberton would realize that his quiet, nervous restoration assistant was actually an FBI agent gathering evidence to destroy his criminal empire was still weeks away. But Izzy could already visualize the shock and betrayal that would replace his current arrogance when federal agents arrived with search warrants and arrest orders based on the evidence she had been methodically collecting for the past 18 months. 3 weeks after the public humiliation over the damaged Monet, Izzy found herself being summoned to Vincent Pemberton's private office for what he described as a career development conversation. The irony was not lost on her that this meeting, intended to either bring her deeper into the criminal organization or eliminate her as a potential threat, would provide exactly the evidence she needed to document the network's highest-level operations and identify the international connections that had made prosecution so challenging for federal investigators. The private office located on the 3rd floor of Pemberton Galleries was a carefully curated space designed to impress wealthy clients and intimidate employees, filled with artwork that Izzy had already identified as either stolen or forged based on her extensive research into the gallery's inventory. As she sat in the chair across from Pemberton's antique desk, projecting the nervous energy of someone expecting to be fired, she was actually using the opportunity to photograph documents left visible on his desk and memorize details about the office's security systems. "Izzy, I've been reconsidering your position here at the gallery," Pemberton began, his tone carrying the paternalistic authority that he used to manipulate employees and clients alike. "Your technical skills are exceptional, and despite the unfortunate incident with the Monet, I believe you have potential that we haven't fully explored yet. However, that potential can only be realized if you demonstrate the discretion and loyalty that our most important work requires." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in criminal recruitment that Izzy had been anticipating since the beginning of her undercover assignment. Pemberton's approach was sophisticated and incremental, designed to gradually involve her in increasingly questionable activities while providing plausible legal explanations for everything she was being asked to do. He began by offering her a significant salary increase and promotion to senior restoration specialist, contingent on her willingness to work on special projects that required absolute confidentiality. Our most discerning clients require services that go beyond simple restoration, Pemberton explained, watching Izzy's reaction carefully for signs of understanding or resistance. Sometimes we acquire pieces that require extensive authentication work, or we help clients with documentation issues that need to be resolved delicately. These projects are perfectly legal, but they involve sensitive commercial information that could be damaging if it became public knowledge. Izzy's response was carefully calibrated to demonstrate the combination of financial desperation and moral flexibility that would make her useful to the organization while maintaining the naive persona that had allowed her to avoid suspicion during her initial infiltration. She expressed gratitude for the opportunity while asking questions that revealed just enough sophistication to be valuable without appearing knowledgeable enough to be dangerous. The special project that Pemberton assigned to Izzy was a Van Gogh sketch that supposedly needed authentication before being offered to private collectors. The piece had been in the gallery's possession for months, but Pemberton claimed that recent scholarship had raised questions about its provenance that needed to be resolved through technical analysis and documentation research. Izzy recognized immediately that she was being asked to create false authentication documents for a stolen artwork, but she maintained her facade of naive compliance while mentally cataloging the evidence that this assignment would provide. Over the following weeks, Izzy's access to the network's operations expanded dramatically as she proved her willingness to participate in questionable activities without asking uncomfortable questions about their ultimate purpose. She was introduced to Marcus Weber, a master forger whose reproductions were so sophisticated that they had fooled auction house experts and museum curators for over a decade. Weber operated from a private studio in Queens, where he created forgeries of famous paintings that were then substituted for originals in private collections, with the originals being sold to unwitting buyers through legitimate auction houses. The relationship between Pemberton's gallery and Weber's forgery operation was more complex than Izzy had initially understood from her external surveillance and financial investigations. Rather than simply selling forged artwork to unsuspecting collectors, they were operating a sophisticated swap system that allowed wealthy clients to sell valuable pieces from their collections while retaining convincing reproductions for display. The original artwork was then laundered through a network of international dealers who could provide legitimate-seeming provenance documentation. Izzy's role in authenticating the Van Gogh sketch introduced her to Dr. Harrison Blackwood, a corrupt art historian whose academic credentials and museum connections allowed him to create authentication documents that could withstand expert scrutiny. Blackwood had spent decades building relationships with auction houses, insurance companies, and law enforcement agencies, making him invaluable to the network's operations and extremely dangerous to any investigation that threatened to expose their activities. The evidence that Izzy was gathering during this phase of her infiltration revealed the true scope and sophistication of the criminal organization she had been assigned to investigate. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward art forgery operation was actually an international network that included corrupt museum officials, unscrupulous private collectors, offshore financial institutions, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering operations. Each day brought new challenges as Izzy balanced her cover responsibilities with her investigative mission while avoiding the increasing paranoia that affected everyone involved in the network. The criminals she was investigating had built their organizations specifically to avoid law enforcement detection, and they remained constantly alert for signs that their operations had been compromised. Any suspicious behavior or inconsistency in her cover story could result in exposure that would not only end her investigation but potentially cost her life. The psychological demands of maintaining her undercover identity were intensified by the moral complexity of participating in crimes that caused real harm to victims whose artwork was being stolen and collectors who were unknowingly purchasing forged pieces. Each authentication document she helped create and every forged painting she examined represented someone's financial loss and cultural heritage being exploited for criminal profit. Izzy's FBI handlers provided support through carefully orchestrated meetings disguised as social encounters, but the nature of her deep cover assignment meant that she had to make most tactical decisions independently while ensuring that her evidence-gathering activities would not be detected by increasingly suspicious criminals. The success of the investigation depended on her ability to maintain her cover while documenting crimes that could result in federal prosecution of the entire network. As her access to the organization's operations expanded, Izzy began to understand that bringing down Pemberton's network would require more than simply gathering evidence of their current criminal activities. The investigation would need to document their historical crimes, identify all members of the network, and gather evidence that could be used to recover stolen artwork and prosecute money laundering activities across multiple jurisdictions. 6 months into her infiltration, Izzy received an invitation that both thrilled and terrified her. Vincent Pemberton was bringing her to an exclusive private auction held in a Hamptons mansion where the network's most important clients gathered to bid on artwork that would never appear in public sales catalogs. This event, known within the organization as the Collection, represented the highest level of the criminal network's operations and would provide Izzy with access to evidence that could expose the international scope of their activities. The mansion belonging to tech billionaire Jonathan Sterling served as the perfect venue for illegal art transactions, with its private location, sophisticated security systems, and owner who had both the resources to acquire stolen masterpieces and the connections to ensure that his activities remained hidden from law enforcement scrutiny. Sterling's collection included paintings that had been reported stolen from European museums during World War II, ancient artifacts looted from archaeological sites, and contemporary works that had disappeared from private collections under mysterious circumstances. Izzy's preparation for the auction required careful attention to both her cover story and her evidence-gathering capabilities, as she would be surrounded by criminals who had spent decades avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. She needed to document the attendees, the artwork being offered, and the transactions taking place while maintaining her persona as a naive restoration specialist who was gradually being brought into the organization's more sensitive operations. The guest list for the auction read like a catalog of international wealth and corruption, including oligarchs seeking to move assets beyond the reach of sanctions, tech executives looking for alternative investments that could be hidden from regulators, entertainment industry figures using art purchases to launder money from questionable sources, and legitimate collectors who had been drawn into the network through their desire to acquire pieces that were not available through legal channels. Vincent Pemberton's behavior during the drive to the Hamptons revealed both his excitement about the evening's prospects and his continued evaluation of Izzy's suitability for deeper involvement in the network's operations. He provided her with detailed background information about several of the evening's lots, ostensibly to help her understand the authentication work that might be required, but actually testing her reactions to increasingly obvious criminal activities. "Tonight you'll see how our most important clients conduct business," Pemberton explained as their car approached Sterling's estate. "These are people who appreciate discretion and expect complete confidentiality about their collecting activities. Your role is to observe, learn, and demonstrate that you understand the importance of maintaining the trust that makes these relationships possible." The auction itself was conducted with all the formality and sophistication of legitimate sales at Christie's or Sotheby's, complete with professional auctioneers, detailed catalog descriptions, and bidding protocols that masked the criminal nature of the transactions taking place. However, Izzy's trained eye immediately identified numerous red flags that revealed the true nature of the event, including lot descriptions that contained coded language about provenance, bidding patterns that suggested money laundering rather than legitimate collecting, and security measures that were designed to prevent documentation rather than protect valuable artwork. The evening's first major lot was a Picasso sketch that Izzy recognized from her pre-assignment research as a piece that had been stolen from a private collector in Switzerland 3 years earlier. The bidding was aggressive and reached levels that far exceeded the work's legitimate market value, suggesting that the sale was being used to transfer money between criminal organizations rather than simply acquire artwork for aesthetic appreciation. Izzy's cover as a restoration specialist allowed her to examine several pieces closely while maintaining detailed mental notes about their condition, mark, and other identifying characteristics that would be crucial for recovery efforts once the network was dismantled. She was particularly interested in a collection of ancient Greek artifacts that showed clear signs of recent excavation damage, indicating that they had been looted from archaeological sites within the past few years. The social dynamics of the auction revealed the sophisticated network of relationships that made the criminal organization so difficult for law enforcement to penetrate. Conversations between bidders revealed ongoing business relationships that extended far beyond art transactions, including real estate deals, technology investments, and financial arrangements that suggested a comprehensive criminal ecosystem rather than a simple art forgery operation. Dr. Harrison Blackwood's presence at the auction confirmed Izzy's suspicions about his role in providing false documentation for the network's operations. She observed him consulting with multiple bidders about authentication issues and provenance documentation, clearly offering his academic credentials and museum connections to legitimize transactions that involved stolen or forged artwork. The most significant development of the evening came when Jonathan Sterling personally introduced Izzy to several major collectors as Pemberton's new authentication specialist, effectively endorsing her presence in the network's highest-level operations. This introduction provided her with access to conversations and relationships that would be crucial for understanding the international scope of the criminal organization. The auction's final lot was a Monet water lily painting that Izzy immediately recognized as the authentic version of the piece she had deliberately damaged during her staged confrontation with Pemberton months earlier. The realization that her mistake had been part of a larger scheme to authenticate and sell a stolen masterpiece provided crucial evidence about the network's methods for disposing of high-value artwork while maintaining plausible legal cover. The post-auction reception allowed Izzy to gather intelligence about the network's future operations, including planned acquisitions of artwork from private collections that were experiencing financial difficulties and upcoming authentication projects that would require her expertise. The conversations she overheard revealed the truly international scope of the criminal organization, with connections to corrupt officials in multiple countries and partnerships with other criminal networks involved in drug trafficking and arms dealing. As the evening concluded and she returned to Manhattan with Pemberton, Izzy understood that she had gathered evidence that could support prosecution of the entire network under RICO statutes, with charges that could result in lengthy prison sentences for all major participants. However, she also recognized that the investigation was entering its most dangerous phase, as her increased access to sensitive operations would make her a target if her true identity was discovered. The success of the evening had elevated her status within the organization, but it had also increased the scrutiny she faced from other members who remained suspicious of outsiders and constantly vigilant for signs of law enforcement infiltration. Her challenge now was to maintain her cover while gathering the additional evidence needed to ensure successful prosecution of crimes that spanned multiple jurisdictions and involved some of the world's wealthiest and most influential individuals.
The moment that would define the trajectory of Izzy's investigation came during what should have been a routine authentication session in the gallery's basement restoration lab. While examining a supposedly 16th-century Italian altarpiece that had recently arrived for evaluation, Izzy discovered hidden compartments behind the painted panels that contained documents dating back 70 years, revealing that Vincent Pemberton's criminal organization was built on the foundation of Nazi-looted art that had been systematically laundered through legitimate galleries since the end of World War II. The documents, written in German and preserved with meticulous care, included inventory lists from concentration camps, shipping manifests for artwork stolen from Jewish families across occupied Europe, and correspondence between Nazi officials and art dealers who had helped facilitate the theft of cultural treasures on an industrial scale. Most chillingly, the papers included a detailed plan for post-war laundering of stolen artwork through a network of galleries and private collectors that would make the pieces virtually impossible to trace back to their original owners. Izzy's discovery transformed her understanding of the criminal organization she had been investigating from a contemporary forgery and money laundering operation into something far more sinister, a multi-generational criminal enterprise that had profited from genocide and had spent decades systematically erasing the evidence of their historical crimes, while continuing to expand their operations into new areas of art-related criminal activity. The challenge of documenting her discovery without alerting Pemberton to her true identity required careful planning and split-second decision-making as she worked alone in the restoration lab. Using techniques learned during her FBI training, she photographed each document while maintaining her cover story of conducting routine authentication work on the altarpiece. The evidence she was gathering would not only support prosecution of current criminal activities but could also lead to the recovery of artwork stolen from Holocaust victims and the identification of their rightful heirs. The historical documents revealed that Vincent Pemberton's father, Wilhelm Pemberton, had been a key figure in the Nazi art looting operation, using his position as a gallery owner in occupied Paris to facilitate the theft of masterpieces from Jewish collectors and museums. After the war, he had immigrated to the United States under a false identity and used stolen artwork as the foundation for building what would become one of New York's most respected galleries. The implications of Izzy's discovery extended far beyond the current criminal investigation to include potential war crimes prosecutions, international repatriation efforts, and civil litigation that could result in the return of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of stolen artwork to the families of Holocaust victims. The evidence she had uncovered would require coordination between federal law enforcement agencies, international investigators, and organizations dedicated to recovering Nazi-looted art. Vincent Pemberton's reaction when he discovered Izzy in the restoration lab with the opened altarpiece was a mixture of panic and rage that confirmed both the significance of her discovery and the immediate danger she now faced. His carefully maintained facade of sophisticated gallery owner disappeared as he realized that the documents his family had hidden for decades had been discovered by someone whose true loyalties he could no longer trust. "What exactly do you think you're doing with that piece?" Pemberton demanded, his voice carrying a menace that Izzy had never heard before. "Those compartments are part of the artwork's historical significance, and they should never be opened without proper consultation with the owners and appropriate scholarly supervision." Izzy's response required perfect execution of her cover persona while preparing for the possibility that her true identity had been compromised and that she might need to defend herself or escape from a situation that was rapidly becoming life-threatening. She projected confusion and concern about having accidentally damaged the piece while maintaining her naive demeanor and apparent ignorance about the significance of what she had discovered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Pemberton, I was just conducting the standard structural analysis that you requested, and the panel seemed loose, so I thought I should investigate whether there was underlying damage that might affect the authentication," Izzy replied, her voice carrying the trembling uncertainty that had characterized her cover persona while her mind raced through contingency plans for various escalation scenarios. The tense confrontation in the restoration lab revealed the paranoia and desperation that lay beneath Pemberton's sophisticated exterior as he struggled to assess whether Izzy's discovery was the result of professional thoroughness or investigative intent. His questions became increasingly aggressive and personal as he probed for signs that she understood the significance of the documents or had photographed them for purposes beyond her stated authentication responsibilities. The arrival of Marcus Weber at the gallery during the confrontation added another layer of danger as the master forger's criminal instincts immediately recognized the threat that Izzy's discovery represented to the entire network. Weber's suggestion that they resolve the situation permanently made it clear that Izzy's life was now in immediate danger and that her cover story might not be sufficient to ensure her survival. Izzy's training in high-stress situations allowed her to maintain her facade while preparing for multiple contingencies, including the possibility that she would need to abandon her cover and call for FBI backup if the situation continued to escalate. However, she also recognized that prematurely ending the investigation would prevent the recovery of Nazi-looted artwork and the prosecution of crimes that had caused immeasurable harm to Holocaust victims and their families. The resolution of the immediate crisis came when Dr. Harrison Blackwood arrived at the gallery and provided expert opinion that Izzy's discovery of the hidden documents was consistent with legitimate authentication procedures and that her apparent ignorance about their historical significance made her unlikely to be a law enforcement threat. His academic authority helped defuse the situation while buying Izzy time to plan her next moves. However, the incident had fundamentally changed the dynamics of her investigation, as Pemberton and his associates would now monitor her activities much more closely while taking additional precautions to protect their most sensitive operations. The challenge ahead would be completing her evidence gathering while navigating the increased suspicion and security measures that would make every aspect of her mission more dangerous. The documents she had discovered and photographed would ultimately provide the foundation for international cooperation in recovering stolen artwork and prosecuting war crimes. But first she needed to survive long enough to deliver the evidence to her FBI handlers and coordinate the complex law enforcement operation that would be required to bring justice to criminals who had evaded accountability for over 7 decades. The weeks following Izzy's discovery of the Nazi documents marked a dramatic shift in the atmosphere of Pemberton galleries as Vincent Pemberton implemented security measures that made every aspect of her continued infiltration exponentially more dangerous. New surveillance cameras appeared throughout the gallery. Keycard access restrictions were installed on previously open areas, and most significantly, Izzy found herself under constant observation by Marcus Weber, whose criminal instincts had identified her as a potential threat that required continuous monitoring. The psychological pressure of maintaining her cover while being watched by experienced criminals who specialized in avoiding law enforcement detection pushed Izzy's undercover skills to their absolute limits. Every conversation was potentially being recorded, every action was scrutinized for signs of investigative intent, and any inconsistency in her behavior could result in exposure that would not only end her mission but quite possibly cost her life. Vincent Pemberton's behavior toward Izzy oscillated between suspicious interrogation and attempts at manipulation designed to test her loyalty and determine whether she posed a threat to the organization. He began assigning her to increasingly sensitive projects while monitoring her reactions and responses for signs that she understood the criminal implications of the work she was being asked to perform. The most significant test came when Pemberton asked Izzy to authenticate a collection of paintings that had recently arrived from a private European collector who needed to liquidate assets quickly due to financial difficulties. The pieces, which included works attributed to Renoir, Degas, and Cézanne, bore subtle signs that suggested they had been stolen from their rightful owners and were being processed through the network's laundering operation. Izzy's authentication work on the collection required her to document evidence of their likely theft while maintaining her cover story and avoiding suspicion from Weber, who observed her work with the intensity of someone trained to identify threats. She needed to photograph identifying marks, catalog numbers, and other evidence that could be used to trace the paintings back to their legitimate owners while projecting the naive professionalism that had characterized her cover persona. The challenge was complicated by the arrival of 2 new associates whom Pemberton introduced as security consultants but who were clearly experienced criminals brought in to provide additional scrutiny of Izzy's activities and behavior. Their presence added another layer of surveillance while making it virtually impossible for her to communicate with her FBI handlers through the established protocols that had supported her investigation. Dr. Harrison Blackwood's increasing involvement in evaluating Izzy's work represented perhaps the greatest threat to her continued infiltration, as his academic expertise and criminal experience made him uniquely qualified to identify inconsistencies in her cover story or professional behavior that might indicate law enforcement training. His questions about her academic background and restoration techniques became increasingly probing and specific, designed to expose any gaps in her preparation or knowledge. The paranoia affecting the entire organization was heightened by external pressures that Izzy gradually learned about through overheard conversations and observed behavior changes among network members. International law enforcement agencies had apparently begun investigating art theft and money laundering operations similar to Pemberton's network, creating anxiety about potential exposure and leading to emergency meetings and enhanced security protocols. Izzy's access to these high-level discussions provided crucial intel about the network's international connections and their contingency plans for avoiding prosecution if their operations were discovered. Her presence at these meetings also increased the scrutiny she faced from other participants who remained suspicious of anyone who had not been part of the organization for many years. The most dangerous moment came during a late-night meeting in Pemberton's office when Marcus Wilbur directly confronted Izzy about inconsistencies he claimed to have identified in her behavior and background. His questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of law enforcement techniques and suggested that he had conducted his own investigation into her identity and qualifications. "There's something about you that doesn't add up," Wilbur said, his tone carrying the cold certainty of someone who had survived in criminal organizations by trusting his instincts about potential threats. "Your technical skills are too advanced for someone with your supposed experience. Your reactions to certain situations suggest training that goes beyond art restoration, and you ask questions that seem designed to gather information rather than simply perform your assigned duties." Izzy's response to Wilbur's confrontation required perfect execution of her cover persona while preparing for the possibility that her true identity had been discovered and that she might need to fight for her life or attempt an emergency escape. She projected the nervous confusion of someone who would be falsely accused while mentally reviewing the self-defense techniques and emergency protocols that could keep her alive if the situation escalated to violence. The support she received from an unexpected source, Dr. Blackwood, who defended her competence and professionalism based on his observation of her authentication work, provided temporary relief from Weber's suspicions while highlighting the complex dynamics within the criminal organization. However, Izzy understood that this protection was fragile and could disappear instantly if any additional evidence of her true identity was discovered. The incident forced Izzy to reconsider her operational timeline and evidence-gathering priorities, as the increasing suspicion and surveillance made it unlikely that she could maintain her cover much longer. She needed to complete her documentation of the network's operations and gather the evidence necessary for successful prosecution while preparing for the possibility that she would need to abort the mission and call for backup if her safety was further compromised. The psychological toll of maintaining her cover under such intense scrutiny was exhausting, requiring constant vigilance and perfect performance of her fabricated persona while dealing with the stress of knowing that any mistake could be fatal. The success of her mission now depended on her ability to complete her objectives while navigating an increasingly dangerous environment where experienced criminals were actively looking for evidence that she was not who she claimed to be. The moment Izzy had been prepared for, around 18 months of careful infiltration, arrived when Vincent Pemberton announced that the network would be conducting its most ambitious operation yet: the theft and immediate laundering of 3 masterpieces from the Metropolitan Museum of Art during a private donor reception where security would be focused on protecting wealthy patrons rather than monitoring artwork. Operation would provide Izzy with evidence of active conspiracy to commit major felonies while also creating the opportunity she needed to signal her FBI handlers and coordinate the takedown of the entire criminal organization. The planning meetings for the museum heist revealed the true sophistication and international scope of Pemberton's network, as participants included corrupt museum security personnel, technology specialists capable of disabling alarm systems, and international art dealers who had already arranged buyers for the stolen pieces before the theft even occurred. Izzy's role in the operation was to provide authentication services that would allow the stolen artwork to be sold immediately through legitimate channels using forged provenance documentation. The 3 target pieces, Van self-portrait, a Monet water lily painting, and a Picasso blue period work, had been selected specifically because their theft would generate enormous media attention while demonstrating the network's capability to steal artwork from even the most secure institutions. The psychological impact of such a high-profile crime was intended to intimidate law enforcement agencies and rival criminal organizations while enhancing the network's reputation among potential clients. Izzy's preparation for the operation required her to balance her role in the criminal conspiracy with her responsibility to prevent the theft and protect invaluable cultural treasures that belong to the public. She needed to gather evidence of the planned crime while positioning herself to signal law enforcement without alerting the criminals to her true identity or jeopardizing the broader investigation. The technical aspects of the planned heist revealed the network's access to sophisticated criminal resources, including insider information about museum security protocols, electronic surveillance equipment, and specialized tools designed for removing paintings from their frames and security systems without triggering alarms. The operation was planned with military precision and involved contingency plans for multiple scenarios that might arise during execution. Vincent Pemberton's behavior during the planning phase revealed both his excitement about the operation's potential profits and his continued suspicion about Izzy's loyalty and discretion. He assigned her to work directly with Marcus Weber on preparing the authentication documents that would be needed to sell the stolen pieces, creating a situation where any mistake in maintaining her cover could result in immediate exposure and potentially violent consequences. The authentication work itself required Izzy to create false documentation that would convince potential buyers that the stolen pieces had legitimate provenance and could be legally owned and displayed. This process involved forging academic certificates, creating fake exhibition histories, and developing fictional ownership records that could withstand scrutiny from experts and law enforcement agencies. Dr. Harrison Blackwood's involvement in reviewing Izzy's authentication work created additional pressure as his academic expertise made him capable of identifying technical errors or inconsistencies that might reveal her true intentions or qualifications. His approval of her work was essential for the operation to proceed, but his continued scrutiny made every aspect of her preparation more dangerous. The most challenging aspect of Izzy's position was maintaining her cover while subtly sabotaging the operation in ways that would prevent the theft without alerting the criminals to her interference. She needed to introduce flaws into the authentication documents that would make them unusable for their intended purpose while appearing to be the result of inexperience rather than deliberate sabotage. The breakthrough moment came when Izzy realized that she could use the network's own paranoia against them by creating authentication documents that were technically perfect but contained subtle markers that would immediately identify them as forgeries to anyone with access to law enforcement databases. This approach would allow the operation to proceed as planned while ensuring that any attempt to sell the stolen artwork would immediately alert authorities to the criminals' identities and locations. The week before the planned heist, Izzy received information that changed everything about her mission timeline and objectives. Through her conversations and observed behavior, she learned that Vincent Pemberton had become suspicious enough about her true identity to order her elimination immediately after the museum operation was completed. Weber had been assigned to ensure that she disappeared permanently along with any evidence that might connect her to law enforcement. This intelligence forced Izzy to accelerate her timeline for ending the investigation and calling for backup, as she would not survive long enough to gather additional evidence if she allowed the operation to proceed as planned. However, she also recognized that prematurely ending the mission would prevent the prosecution of crimes that had caused immense harm to victims over multiple decades. The solution came when Izzy realized that she could use the museum heist as the perfect opportunity to expose the entire network while protecting the artwork and ensuring her own survival. By timing her revelation of her true identity and the arrival of law enforcement backup to coincide with the criminals' attempt to execute their plan, she could catch them in the act of committing major felonies while preventing any actual theft of artwork. The final phase of her preparation involved creating detailed maps of the museum layout,
identifying optimal positions for FBI tactical teams, and developing communication protocols that would allow her to coordinate the takedown operation while maintaining her cover until the critical moment.
She also needed to prepare for the possibility that some members of the network
might escape to bring them to justice.
As the day of the planned heist approached, Izzy felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that
Characterized high-stakes law enforcement operations.
everything she had worked toward
During 18 months of dangerous undercover work would be decided in a few hours of coordinated action that would either result in the successful prosecution of a major criminal organization or potentially cost her life if any aspect of the operation went wrong.
The evening of the Metropolitan Museum's exclusive donor reception arrived with unseasonably warm weather that would work in favor of the FBI tactical teams positioned around the building's perimeter, as guests would be comfortable moving between indoor and outdoor spaces where surveillance and intervention would be easier to coordinate. Izzy arrived at the museum with Vincent Pemberton and Marcus Weber, carrying authentication equipment that concealed recording devices and emergency communication systems that would allow her to coordinate the takedown operation when the criminals committed themselves to the theft. The reception itself was a glittering affair attended by Manhattan's cultural elite, wealthy donors and museum trustees who had no idea that they were providing cover for one of the most ambitious art theft operations ever attempted in New York City. The irony of using a celebration of artistic philanthropy as cover for stealing priceless cultural treasures was not lost on Izzy as she moved through the reception while mentally tracking the positions of both criminals and law enforcement personnel. Vincent Pemberton's behavior during the early stages of the reception revealed both his excitement about the operation and his continued nervousness about Izzy's presence, as he assigned her to remain close to him throughout the evening while Weber coordinated the technical aspects of disabling security systems and communicating with their accomplices inside the museum's security department. The constant supervision made it challenging for Izzy to communicate with her FBI handlers, but it also ensured that she would have a front-row seat to document Pemberton's direct involvement in the conspiracy. The first phase of the theft operation began precisely at 9:30 p.m. when corrupt museum security personnel created a diversion that drew attention away from the galleries containing the target artwork while simultaneously disabling specific alarm systems and surveillance cameras. The sophistication of the operation was impressive and terrifying, demonstrating the network's ability to compromise even the most secure cultural institutions through a combination of inside information and technical expertise. Izzy's role during the theft was to accompany Pemberton and Weber to the galleries containing the target pieces, where she would immediately begin creating authentication documentation that would allow the stolen artwork to be transported and sold before law enforcement could organize an effective response. However, her true purpose was to gather evidence of each criminal's direct participation in the theft while positioning herself to signal the FBI tactical teams at the optimal moment for intervention. The moment when the criminals actually removed the Van Gogh self-portrait from its frame and security mounting provided Izzy with uncontrovertible evidence of grand theft that would support federal prosecution under multiple statutes. She documented the theft using concealed recording equipment while maintaining her cover story of reluctant participation motivated by fear and financial desperation. Marcus Weber's expertise in art theft was evident in the professional efficiency with which he removed the paintings from their security systems and prepared them for transport. His methods revealed extensive experience with similar operations and suggested that the network had been responsible for numerous unsolved art thefts over the years, making his capture and prosecution essential for solving multiple open cases. The critical moment arrived when Vincent Pemberton personally supervised the removal of the Picasso Blue period work while providing detailed instructions about how the piece should be packaged and transported to avoid damage that might reduce its resale value. His direct involvement in the theft eliminated any possibility of claiming ignorance or distance from the criminal conspiracy, providing prosecutors with evidence that would support lengthy prison sentences. Izzy's signal to FBI tactical teams was delivered through a coded phrase transmitted via her concealed communication device when all three criminals were in the same gallery with the stolen artwork, ensuring that they could be arrested simultaneously while caught in possession of the stolen pieces.
The timing was critical, as any delay might allow some conspirators to escape, while premature intervention might prevent the gathering of sufficient evidence for successful prosecution. The FBI's response was swift and overwhelming, with tactical teams entering the museum from multiple directions while coordinating with museum security and local law enforcement to secure all entrances and prevent any escape attempts. The criminals' shock and confusion when they realized they had been caught in an elaborate sting operation was evident in their attempts to claim innocence and shift blame to other participants. Vincent Pemberton's immediate attempt to portray himself as a victim of Izzy's deception revealed both his desperation and his recognition that the evidence against him was overwhelming. His claims that he had been manipulated by an undercover federal agent would provide little legal protection, as the prosecution could demonstrate that he had initiated and planned the criminal conspiracy long before Izzy became involved. Marcus Weber's violent resistance to arrest confirmed Izzy's assessment of his dangerous nature and provided additional charges that would increase his potential prison sentence. His possession of weapons and his threats against law enforcement officers demonstrated the serious threat that the network had posed to public safety beyond their art-related crimes. Dr. Harrison Blackwood's arrest at his university office, coordinated to occur simultaneously with the museum operation, provided crucial evidence about the network's academic connections and authentication fraud operations. His cooperation with law enforcement in exchange for reduced charges would prove essential for prosecuting other members of the network and recovering additional stolen artwork. The immediate aftermath of the arrests revealed the true scope of the criminal organization, as FBI agents executed search warrants at multiple locations throughout New York and internationally, seizing artwork, financial records, and communication devices that would support prosecution of dozens of conspirators across multiple jurisdictions. Izzy's emergence from her undercover identity was both liberating and emotionally challenging, as she transitioned from 18 months of careful deception back to her authentic identity as FBI Special Agent Isabella Rodriguez. The success of the operation validated the risks she had taken and the sacrifices she had made, but it also marked the beginning of extensive legal proceedings that would require her testimony and continued involvement for years to come. The recovery of the stolen masterpieces and their immediate return to public display sent a powerful message about law enforcement's commitment to protecting cultural heritage, while demonstrating that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations could be penetrated and destroyed through patient investigation and coordinated action. The arrests at the Metropolitan Museum triggered a cascade of law enforcement actions across 3 continents, as FBI agents working in coordination with Interpol and national police forces executed simultaneous raids on properties and businesses connected to Vincent Pemberton's criminal network. The evidence that Izzy had gathered during her 18-month infiltration provided the foundation for search warrants and arrest orders that would ultimately expose the largest art theft and money laundering operation in modern history. The international scope of the takedown operation revealed connections that even Izzy had not fully understood during her undercover work, as law enforcement agencies discovered network affiliates operating out of London, Paris, Geneva, and Hong Kong. Each location served specific functions within the criminal organization, from forging provenance documents and creating sophisticated reproductions to laundering money through legitimate art sales and maintaining relationships with corrupt officials who facilitated illegal transactions. Vincent Pemberton's cooperation with federal prosecutors, motivated by his desire to avoid a life sentence under RICO statutes, provided crucial intelligence about the network's historical operations and international connections. His detailed confession revealed that the organization had been responsible for over 300 art thefts across 4 decades, including several high-profile museum heists that had never been solved by law enforcement agencies. The evidence recovered from Pemberton galleries and associated properties filled several warehouses and included not only stolen artwork but also detailed records of the network's financial operations, client relationships, and future plans for expansion into other criminal activities. The documentation provided prosecutors with a comprehensive picture of the organization's structure and methods that would support successful prosecution of all major participants. Marcus Weber's apartment in Queens yielded perhaps the most significant discoveries, including a workshop where he had created forgeries of famous paintings and a detailed catalog of his work that revealed the true scope of his criminal activities.
The forensic analysis of his forgeries would ultimately help law enforcement agencies identify dozens of fake works that had been sold to unsuspecting collectors and museums worldwide. Dr. Harrison Blackwood's academic office and personal residence contained extensive files related to his authentication fraud activities, including correspondence with corrupt museum officials and detailed instructions for creating false provenance documentation. His cooperation with investigators would prove essential for identifying other academics and museum professionals who had participated in the network's operations. The recovery of Nazi-looted artwork from the hidden compartments that Izzy had discovered marked the beginning of an international repatriation effort that would return stolen cultural treasures to their rightful owners or their families. The World Jewish Congress and other organizations dedicated to Holocaust recovery efforts praised the investigation's results and provided assistance in identifying the original owners of recovered pieces. The financial investigation conducted by FBI forensic accountants revealed that the network had laundered over $2.3 billion through art transactions over the past 2 decades, with profits being distributed among participants and reinvested in legitimate businesses that served as fronts for continued criminal activities. The complexity of the money laundering operation required coordination between multiple federal agencies and international financial intelligence units. The prosecution strategy developed by federal attorneys emphasized the network's impact on cultural heritage and individual victims while highlighting the sophistication and international scope of their criminal activities. The case was structured to support maximum sentences for all major participants while providing incentives for cooperation that would lead to additional recoveries and prosecutions. Izzy's testimony before federal grand juries provided the foundation for indictments against 47 individuals across multiple jurisdictions, including charges ranging from art theft and money laundering to conspiracy and racketeering. Her detailed accounts of the network's operations and her documentation of specific criminal activities would prove crucial for securing convictions at trial. The media coverage of the investigation and arrests brought international attention to the problem of art crime and the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies in investigating sophisticated criminal organizations that operate across multiple jurisdictions. Izzy's role in the investigation was initially kept confidential for security reasons, but her eventual identification as the undercover agent who had penetrated the network made her a symbol of law enforcement dedication and courage. The cooperation of several network participants in exchange for reduced sentences provided investigators with additional intelligence about related criminal organizations and ongoing art crime operations. This information would support future investigations and help law enforcement agencies understand the broader ecosystem of international art crime. The civil litigation that followed the criminal prosecutions resulted in the recovery of stolen artwork worth over $400 million and the payment of restitution to victims who had been defrauded by the network's operations. The legal precedents established by these cases would strengthen future efforts to recover stolen cultural property and hold art criminals accountable for their actions. The institutional reforms implemented by museums and auction houses in response to the investigation included enhanced authentication procedures, improved due diligence requirements for accepting consignments, and better coordination with law enforcement agencies to identify potentially stolen artwork. These changes would make it significantly more difficult for future criminal organizations to exploit legitimate art market institutions. The academic consequences for Dr. Blackwood and other scholars who had participated in authentication fraud led to widespread reforms in how academic institutions evaluate and oversee their faculty's consulting activities. New conflict of interest policies and enhanced transparency requirements would help prevent similar abuse of academic credentials in the future. The international law enforcement cooperation that had made the investigation successful became a model for future efforts to combat transnational organized crime, demonstrating the effectiveness of patient-coordinated operations that prioritize long-term intelligence gathering over immediate arrests. The relationships and protocols developed during the investigation would continue to support international efforts to combat art crime and related criminal activities. As the immediate aftermath of the arrests settled into the longer process of prosecution and recovery, Izzy reflected on the transformation that her investigation had achieved not only in dismantling a specific criminal organization but in strengthening the broader international response to art crime and cultural heritage protection. The federal trial of Vincent Pemberton and his co-conspirators began 18 months after their arrests, held in the Southern District of New York Federal Courthouse with unprecedented security measures due to the international attention the case had attracted and the significant financial interests at stake. FBI Special Agent Isabella Rodriguez, no longer hidden behind her Izzy persona, took the witness stand as the prosecution's star witness in what legal experts were calling the most significant art crime prosecution in American history. Izzy's testimony stretched across 5 days of direct examination and cross-examination, during which she provided detailed accounts of her 18-month infiltration of the criminal network while presenting hundreds of pieces of evidence she had gathered documenting the organization's criminal activities. Her composed professional demeanor and meticulous documentation impressed both the jury and legal observers, demonstrating the sophistication and dedication that had made her undercover operation so successful. The prosecution's presentation of evidence revealed the full scope of the criminal organization's activities, including the theft and laundering of over $2.3 billion worth of artwork, the operation of international forgery networks, and the systematic exploitation of Holocaust survivors through the trafficking of Nazi-looted art. Each piece of evidence was corroborated by Izzy's undercover recordings and documentation, creating an overwhelming case for conviction on multiple felony charges. Vincent Pemberton's defense strategy, led by one of New York's most expensive criminal attorneys, attempted to portray him as a legitimate businessman who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals and entrapped by Izzy's undercover operation. However, the defense's arguments were systematically dismantled by the prosecution's presentation of evidence showing Pemberton's leadership role in planning and executing criminal activities over multiple decades. Marcus Weber's trial strategy focused on challenging the admissibility of evidence gathered during Izzy's undercover operation while attempting to discredit her testimony through aggressive cross-examination. However, his violent resistance during arrest and the overwhelming physical evidence recovered from his forgery workshop made his guilt virtually impossible to dispute, leading to his conviction on all charges and the sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Dr. Harrison Blackwood's cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence provided crucial testimony about the network's authentication fraud operations and its connections to corrupt museum and academic officials. His detailed accounts of how academic credentials were exploited to legitimize stolen artwork helped prosecutors demonstrate the sophisticated methods used by the criminal organization to avoid detection. The testimony of victims whose artwork had been stolen or who had unknowingly purchased forged pieces provided emotional context for the jury about the human impact of the network's criminal activities. Holocaust survivors and their descendants who testified about the recovery of family artwork stolen by Nazis brought particular gravity to the proceedings and helped illustrate the historical significance of the crimes being prosecuted. The international scope of the prosecution required coordination with law enforcement agencies and prosecutors from multiple countries, as evidence had been gathered across several jurisdictions and some defendants were being prosecuted simultaneously in European courts. This cooperation demonstrated the global commitment to combating art crime and holding criminals accountable regardless of where their activities occurred. The sentencing phase of the trials provided opportunities for victims to present impact statements describing how the network's criminal activities had affected their lives and cultural heritage. These statements reinforced the seriousness of art crime and its impact on both individual victims and society's shared cultural heritage, supporting arguments for maximum sentences under federal guidelines. Vincent Pemberton's sentence of 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole reflected both the severity of his crimes and his leadership role in the criminal organization. The judge's sentencing statement emphasized that Pemberton had betrayed the trust of clients and colleagues while exploiting cultural
institutions and Holocaust victims for personal profit over multiple decades. The civil asset forfeiture proceedings that followed the criminal convictions resulted in the recovery of additional artwork and financial assets worth over $150 million, which were used to provide restitution to victims and support ongoing efforts to identify and recover stolen cultural property. The forfeiture actions also served as a deterrent to other potential art criminals by demonstrating that profits from such crimes would ultimately be seized by law enforcement. The academic and professional consequences for individuals who had participated in the network's operations extended beyond criminal prosecution to include the loss of professional licenses, academic tenure, and museum positions. These sanctions reinforced the importance of maintaining ethical standards in cultural institutions and provided additional deterrence against future participation in art crime. The legislative response to the investigation included new federal statutes strengthening penalties for art theft and money laundering while improving international cooperation mechanisms for investigating and prosecuting art crime. These legal reforms were designed to address the sophisticated methods used by modern art criminals and to facilitate the recovery of stolen cultural property. The establishment of the Isabella Rodriguez Art Crime Research Center at Quantico provided ongoing training for law enforcement personnel and academic researchers working to combat art crime and protect cultural heritage. The center's programs emphasized the investigative techniques and international cooperation that had made Izzy's undercover operation successful while developing new approaches for addressing evolving threats to cultural property. Izzy's transition from undercover agent to recognized expert in art crime investigation marked the beginning of a new phase in her career dedicated to training other investigators and supporting international efforts to combat cultural property crime. Her experience had demonstrated that sophisticated criminal organizations could be penetrated and destroyed through patient professional law enforcement work supported by appropriate resources and international cooperation. The long-term impact of the investigation and prosecutions extended beyond the specific criminal organization that had been dismantled to influence how law enforcement agencies, cultural institutions, and the international art market approached the prevention and investigation of art crime. The case had established new precedents for international cooperation and demonstrated the effectiveness of long-term undercover operations in penetrating sophisticated criminal networks. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.